So we have the same crew. I'm Jeff. Y'all want to introduce yourselves real quick?
Yeah, I'm Dakota.
And I'm Patrick.
And we chose a good analysis of another political economic paradigm we are living through right now. We did fascism last time, and this one's about neoliberalism. So we read David Harvey's Brief History of Neoliberalism, and Harvey, from what I've read, he is an expert on neoliberalism. Would y'all agree about that?
I would, yeah.
I would say, yeah, he knows a lot about it. Yeah,
That's a topic he talks about a lot. And he has a podcast. He has a lot of talks on YouTube and has written books and so on and so forth. So yeah.
Yeah. So I guess we should just set the stage a little bit, and I'll just try to give a little bit of an introduction. So neoliberalism is what we live in. It's the political economic paradigm we live in, as opposed to I'll just try to take a shot at defining it with reference to liberalism. So liberalism as the foundational philosophical doctrine that emerged out of the Enlightenment way back in the day, that was centered on intellectualism, rationality, free thought, the free market. What else?
Human rights.
Am I missing anything? Human rights. Thank you, Dakota.
Voting, vague notions of voting.
Yes, voting, participation in politics, that eventually got more and more people enfranchised, right? So they could participate in their political systems. And so that was neoliberalism, that was liberalism, not neoliberalism, right? So that was just regular liberalism. And then in the 20th century, we sort of had this great clashing of different paradigms where you had communism enter the mix, and you had fascism enter the mix. You had various forms of authoritarianism enter the mix in terms of ways to approach the politics and ways to organize the economy, right? And so then we have this thing that emerged out of those different philosophies clashing and mangling each other, and out of the wreckage emerged this thing called neoliberalism, which began, I don't know, I guess he traces it in the book. The closest date I could find was 1971 with the Powell memo. So regardless, some people think it dates back to the Reagan regime or Thatcher earlier in the 1970s. The ideological roots are even earlier than that, which we're going to talk about. But so neoliberalism is this political economic paradigm rooted in philosophy, rooted in economics, that centers free market fundamentalism and has all kinds of interesting implications we're going to talk about. But it's a more recent phenomenon than those other great, well, not great, I guess, quote unquote great traditions of the 20th century, thought traditions of the 20th century. Would y'all want to add anything to that, or is that like a good enough start?
Yeah, I'll editorialize a little bit. To me, I find that neoliberalism is really not much different from liberalism, and that the emergence of fascism occurred because of the contradictions of liberalism and the inequalities and kind of tensions and contradictions within the system is why. So I don't think I'm the first person to say this, but this is kind of a phrase that has been sticking in my head, that liberalism or neoliberalism is the midwife of fascism. And even Harvey talks into the book how neoconservatism is kind of like the next stage of neoliberalism, and I guess we'll get to that later on.
Yeah.
But I hesitate to call it like a new ideology. I feel like it's just a restoration of the original like laissez-faire liberalism that existed before the New Deal.
And crucially, that neoliberalism as an ideology was the justification for a class project of reclaiming power after the disaster of the 60s.
Right. That's going to be a dominant theme, is this idea that it's a returning of class power to a I'm trying to remember like the phrasing that he uses. I think he keeps saying like ruling elite, right? Or financial elite. I don't know how deliberate that choice of words is, but basically the ruling class, some type of class project that's going to return ultimate power to the ruling class. And should we talk about how that sort of progression worked before we get into chapter 1? Like, what does it mean to return class power to that like financial elite? Did they lose it at some point? Let's like set the stage here in terms of the class compromise that emerged out of World War II. Do you all want to do that first?
Sure. I think we can jump into that.
So you had you had like this Gilded Age, right, at the in the turn of the century, in the turn of the 20th century, where you just had ridiculous amount of wealth concentrated in a very, very tiny number of wealthy elite, especially in the West.
The robber barons.
Yeah, robber barons, owners of companies that just, in the transition from feudalism to capitalism, it was pretty rough for the working stiff back then, and wealth was very, very, very highly concentrated in an absolutely minuscule number of people's hands. And then what happened after that? What was, like, as sort of communism and socialism emerged and started to sort of put wealth and power a little bit more, try to tip the scale a little bit more in the other way, right? How did that work?
You had.
Go ahead, Dakota.
With the emergence of the Soviet Union, the first major challenge to the hegemonic dominance of capitalism, which was, of course, conquering new markets and using imperialism to do so. And so suddenly you had this data point on the map that said there is an alternative, which, along with a lot of other things, put pressure on Western capitalist countries, right? Because suddenly they weren't the only game in town. So anything that they did and their economic policies, and it was especially made clear during the Great Depression, in which all of the capitalist countries were completely failing and the Soviet Union remained fairly stable, right? They actually came out looking pretty good because they were not bound to the market, right?
Right. So you had these big capitalist powers in the United States, in the UK, in I don't know, what would be the other big capitalist economies of the time, of like the interwar and war, the Great Wars period? France and Germany?
France and Germany, yeah.
Yeah, at least West Germany. And then you had an alternative to capitalists take power, right? The USSR, and then communist China. And then there was, I think we need to talk in the lead up to the neoliberal turn that occurred in the West and also in China that we're going to talk about. What was the sort of political economic paradigm after the sort of global catastrophe, global wreckage that pretty much leveled many capitalist economies in World War II? What was the economic consensus? Let's try to break that down a little bit, that emerged out of World War II and led us into the post-war period of the 50s and 60s.
So I think what you're alluding to is embedded liberalism, or like the Keynesian state. They're
the grand
basically
bargain.
the same thing. Yeah,
right.
It was basically a compromise that the capitalist class had to make with the state, that the state actually had to serve the needs of working people in some capacity, and that the state didn't exist just to facilitate the accumulation of capital.
Yeah, Adolf Reed has written a little bit about this too. Yeah, that obviously it was the grand bargain. So, back in the 30s, labor certainly in America was even stronger, right? But that, there had to be some welfare, and that one of the things that separated America from Europe was that after the Second World War, the European countries, of course, economically were devastated, but also their respective capitalist classes had lost a lot of their legitimacy because of their alliance with fascism. Whereas in America emerged stronger than ever, right, as a major superpower. Of course, it already was extremely powerful, but also the capitalist class maintained its legitimacy, right? It wasn't embroiled in fascism in the same way, right? That obviously, Vichy France, right?
Right, and I think that's probably why the welfare state that emerged from the United States was weaker than that of the welfare states that emerged in Europe, is because the capitalist class was less put into a corner to make such a compromise.
But nonetheless, there was a compromise. There was a grand bargain that was, yeah.
And the compromise was made because it was essentially like, labor will take to the streets and the socialists and communists will overthrow the government, or we, compromise and create this kind of like hybrid social democratic system.
Right. The so-called golden age of capitalism.
Yeah, so that it was true, and it was truly a golden age. At least, I mean, in the United States, in American history, we learn about the 50s and 60s as a time of prosperity, at least for the the white middle classes that were able to accumulate money and accumulate property. And that you had this capitalist machine kind of humming along and producing and accumulating, and that regime sort of continued. And this compromise, what is that? Who is that compromise between?
I would say generally it's between owners and labor mediated through the state. I mean, if the state is like a lawyer, I mean, it's not necessarily like evenly mediated through the state. If the state is like a lawyer, I would say it's at that time it was more advocating on behalf of the of labor than now. It's like it's a lawyer for corporations.
Right. So you have the bosses, right? The capitalists, people who are running the economy. And then you do have a pretty powerful sector of labor, both in the U.S. and in the U.K., that sort of are able to extract this compromise from capital and get this understanding that the prosperity and the wealth generated in this time of abundance should be at least somewhat shared between the two. So you do have rich people and you do have capitalists, but you have workers making a good wage as well, and a lot of them had pensions and benefits to go along with it. And the state was sort of seen in this, and again, we're talking about embedded liberalism, right? So the state is seen as this sort of mediating force that sort of makes sure that compromise is maintained. Is that?
Yeah, it contains the beast of the market, right? It puts some fetters there.
I want to kind of like define a couple things real quick just to make things pretty concrete. So I don't have a start date, but let's just say from the Gilded Age, so the 1880s, 1870s post Reconstruction, up to really World War II, but I guess the Great Depression, that was just like the classical liberal era, economically speaking. And then from the New Deal up until around 1975, that's the era of embedded liberalism, the welfare state, Keynesian economics. And then from around 1975 to today is the neoliberal era, just so we're very clear on which time periods we're talking about. Additionally, I just want to like emphasize that I guess Harvey's use of the word elite, I don't like the word elite because I feel like it kind of plays into like the right-wing culture war. When they talk about elites thing, it doesn't actually mean anything. You can ascribe elite to anybody, the Hollywood elite, the so on and so forth. So I think, and I hope I'm not putting words in his mouth, but what the elite means in this context is literally the people who own land and the means of production, and
the capitalists.
It's the capitalists, the owners. Yeah. So just wanted to put that out there.
Yeah. So we have this regime of accumulation happening in the 50s and 60s, and then the wheels kind of come off in the 70s, and that so you run into this crisis of capital accumulation as you lead in a global crisis in the 70s. That's coupled with a credible threat, both politically and economically, from the left, from socialist and communist, like ideologically, movements, right? And then also labor movements too. So those two things, right? You have this financial crisis, and then you have a credible threat from the left that's sort of combined to lead to sort of open the door for neoliberalism to step in. So what was this crisis of capital accumulation? Part of it was the OPEC oil crisis, right?
Right. Well, I think it was, generally speaking, and I don't want to get like super into it, but I think any capitalist economy that's just dependent on infinite growth is always doomed to fail, and you're going to run out of gas at some point. With the whole like tendency of the rate of profit to fall and diminishing profit margins and so on. So, but definitely the oil embargo was the shock that kind of killed the goose, or whatever the phrase is. Maybe what coronavirus is now, but
right.
Yeah,
that killed the goose.
Yeah, and it's important to remember that even before the oil crisis, unemployment and inflation were becoming more of an issue, right? There were these indicators, right? But it was the oil shock, and of course America's client state Israel, right? That really helped to really bring the hammer down.
Right. So just to clarify, like historically speaking, this is the oil-producing Arab states in the Middle East obviously did not support the U.S. supporting Israel in the Yom Kippur War. I'm not sure which one. The one in 1973.
Yeah.
And decided to essentially just embargo all nations who support Israel.
Got it. Okay, so that sets the scene a little bit, and then obviously let's just define what this actual credible threat from socialism and communism and the labor movement was. Like they were positioned to sort of step in and take some real power out of the hands of capitalists at this time as well. So you have the communist threat coming from the USSR, as well as communist China, and then
third world revolutions.
Third world revolutions. You want to speak to that a little bit, or just wanted to throw that in there?
I mean, I'm sure there's one example that's not, but by and large, most movements for national independence of third world countries in Africa and Asia, how would you say, like the inspiration for those independence movements came from the left. So a lot of the times the core nations, the capitalist nations, the Western European colonial powers tried to like fight against anything that was independence driven, whether that's Vietnam or even if it's not actual independence, although independence was big, especially in Africa, but even in like Latin America, those nations had been independent nations since like the 1820s. But any moderate social democratic reform, any president or leader that wanted to do such had to be taken out. So you have like Arbenz in 54 in Guatemala. You have the coup in Brazil in 64. You have
Chile, but we'll get to that.
Chile in 73. I mean, I don't need to list them all. Iran in 55, I believe.
Well, also in the West too, you had this is a time in the United States when you had actual labor power too, at least to a certain extent.
And you had the civil rights movement. I mean, the 60s, obviously, and all that encapsulates, the ruling class were appalled that so many people from traditionally silent and marginalized groups were suddenly becoming active, right? That was, Noam Chomsky talks about it as the crisis of democracy. The crisis being when too many people get involved, right? And you got to prevent that. And so, which was part of the Powell memo that you mentioned before, right? Is that people were just shocked that, okay, what are black people doing, participating? What does this gay rights movement, et cetera?
Right. So you had these financial elites who were like, okay, this is getting out of hand. We might have to do something about this, in the sense that you have these financial crises creeping up, like unemployment, and it was a stagflation crisis. Was stagflation in the sense that capitalist growth is slowing down, while at the same time inflation is getting out of control as well. So they had to do something about it.